Looks like we're live. Hi, everyone. I'm Doug, and it's my honor to introduce the Comics Academia panel, where some amazing fellow creators, academics, and I dive deep into the history, prose, mechanics, and literature behind comics. This is all to benefit Project Hope. We're on our way to about $1,000 in donations, so any amount is appreciated. We'll also be giving away prizes over the course of this panel. So if you donate any time during this stream, you'll have a chance of winning some lovely comic books. But going back to literature, let's talk about literature. Because if you're watching this, then odds are you've heard the argument that comics are just cheap entertainment, separate from what people call real art, something that doesn't merit deep critical thought or academic study. And if you've heard of me or any of the fantastic people participating here, then you'd know that that isn't true. Comic books, now more than ever, are the mythic tales of today. Movies, television, and even novels nowadays are pulling from comics, and it's not hard to see why. Through them, we can peer into the human condition, sail through space, transcend the bounds of reality itself, sometimes all in a single issue. Comics can mean countless things to countless people, but above all else, they're engines of imagination, allowing us to explore all kinds of social issues through heightened adventures. It's a medium built by generations of storytellers and artists who imagined the impossible and used it as a call to action for a better world. And I'd say that's something that's always worthy of study. Good art always inspires. Now, if any of you have heard of me, then you know that I run a channel called For Every Kind of Geek. And if you've seen any of my work, you know that comics are something I'm very inspired by. I actually started my channel to help get my friends into comics. And when I talked to them, what I heard come up often most was the continuity of comics, specifically how confusing it is. Now, for every character, title, or team book, there's a half a century's worth of creative teams with their own definitive stories to add to these titles. Sometimes this ends up turning a lot of new readers away, but when it's done well, I think it demonstrates something that comics do better than any other medium, and that's additive storytelling. Now, first things first, how do we define additive storytelling? In an interview, writer Jonathan Hickman refers to his storytelling process as something that builds on existing stories instead of ignoring them, adding, I may do things where I destroy the entire Marvel universe, but I always put it back together in a way that puts the characters in an interesting place. In plain terms, additive storytelling in comics means that every story is considered part of continuity. Anything can be built on in something new. Maybe the easiest way to spot this is through character, because every title swaps creative teams every few years. Readers get to see these characters grow and change over time, with each writer exploring different parts of the characters' personalities. People like to cite Alan Moore's Swamp Thing or Mark Waid's Daredevil, but in my opinion, one of the strongest additive writers for character is Matt Fraction. Fraction's been praised as a writer who brings a new approach to established characters, but if you look even deeper into his stories, you'll see that these characterizations are all built on all of those decades of previous comics, giving their characters a kind of weight and consistency in the story. Hawkeye examines Clint Barton as a flawed human being living in a world of literal superheroes. And as a result, we spend a lot of time glimpsing into Clint's insecurities and shortcomings. He's so self-destructive in this book because in his eyes, there's no way to measure up to the people around him. By contrast, though, Fraction also does a great job of humanizing these larger-than-life characters. Maybe my favorite stint on a comic is Fraction's run on Iron Man, which picks up the character's story post-Civil War. If you've read Civil War, you know it's not a great time for Iron Man. The story took a lot of its characters to some pretty dark places, but while some people saw it as a complete loss, something to be written off and ignored, Fraction saw it as a means to delve into the psychology of Iron Man as a character, how he keeps coming back to a very destructive, almost villainous place. One of my favorite issues in the series, which follows Stark in an AA meeting, acts as a complete recap of the character's history, but framed through his battles with addiction. This isn't just a callback to Stark's struggles in Demon in a Bottle, it's a development that influences every iteration of the character that came before and every iteration that comes after. Now, in addition to character, plot and presentation are great ways to show how comic stories can build on one another. Instead of focusing on a single character, focus is given to an event or a theme that writers use previous works to kind of build to. Now, of course, two big names come to mind here, and that's Jonathan Hickman and Grant Morrison. I don't think Grant Morrison needs an introduction. They've redefined a number of superheroes over the decades, but I'd argue their crowning achievement is their Multiversity series. The book and its tie-ins have a number of ongoing plots, but the biggest story at play here is the exploration of the DC multiverse, a realm that holds every story and character on a series of parallel Earths. Morrison's known for their ability to weave all kinds of callbacks in history back into modern stories, and through Multiversity, I'd argue they achieve the single greatest example of additive storytelling to date. Through this story, every iteration and idea in DC Comics is made equally real through this detailed trek through the realms of possibility. Another champion of additive storytelling, actually kind of a contemporary of Morrison's, is Jonathan Hickman, who's famous for his run on the Ultimates and the Avengers, but I'd argue his most ambitious project yet has been his tenure as Marvel's head of X. Through his interlocking miniseries House of X and Powers of 10, Hickman managed to fold every version of the X-Men, including Morrison's, into a brand new narrative that comments on the underlying themes in every version of the story. Of course, this led to the newest iteration of X-Men stories that we see today, with a massive roster of writers and artists creating their own stories that build on the foundation that Hickman established. Each book can stand on its own, but together they build into the story of mutant kind's rise after decades of discrimination and how that shift can affect the entire Marvel universe. While both of these writers like to make their stories massive and comprehensive, they also present them in a way that rewards people the deeper they read into these stories. Instead of just a caption box that reads, pick up this issue to find out why this character's here, each story can stand on its own, but it's given a richer context when you start to read all of these other stories and get the bigger picture. Now, a lot of people see additive storytelling as a recent development, but truth is the idea is as old as shared universes in comics. Back when they made their debuts in the Golden Age, superheroes were largely kept insular from one another by their publishers. But as companies like National Allied, which would become DC, started buying up smaller companies, more characters began to fall into these publishers' catalogs, and companies began planning ways to capitalize on this. First came the Justice Society of America, which incorporated names like the Flash, Hawkman, Green Lantern, and the Spectre into a team book. Now, while the JSA was relegated to Earth 2 in the Silver Age to make way for the more modern Justice League, the team would be reincorporated through the Bronze Age of the 70s and started making regular team-ups with the JLA. And this additive approach only grew with time, leading to massive interconnected universes for DC, Marvel, and even indie publishers who had deep rosters of their own. For a long time, comics were seen as kind of a niche subject, but over the years, we've seen attitudes change. Movie adaptations started introducing people to these characters and worlds, and over time, the long-form stories that they've been a part of. Marvel and DC's cinematic universes are a testament to this, pulling heroes from every generation and genre into massive, sprawling stories that are still going to this day. And in turn, those stories have given a new generation of viewers an appreciation for all of these characters. So, to anyone who's thinking of getting into comics but might be intimidated by all of the scope of it, I say, please give it a chance. Jump in and try to discover something. You might find a story that you really like, or maybe add your own someday. And with that, that's my time. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and there's plenty more on the way from the great folks on the Comics Academia panel. Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely great, Doug. Hi, I'm Mel from New Comics. I'm going to be following up Doug's lovely presentation, and happily enough, it's going to tie in pretty nicely with some of the things that I talked about. But apart from that, people have been talking about in the chat, we do want to make sure that we encourage viewers to donate if they can for the Project Hope. Right now, we're trying to hit for a goal of $1,000. So by all means, if you have the money, if you have the opportunity, please feel free to go into the link for Streamlabs, I think it is, and donate for the cause. But for right now, I'm going to prep up my presentation, and it should be good to go now. Awesome. So my presentation this year, last year I did a presentation talking about Hickman's House of X and specifically the Cohen language. This year I thought I'd change things up and talk about Tales from the Dark Multiverse instead, and how the series explores the idea of tragedy as a genre, and also how tragedy has existed in comics. So to get things started, what was Tales from the Dark Multiverse exactly? So Tales from the Dark Multiverse was an anthology series from DC Comics that spun out of the canonical consequences of Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's Dark Knight's metal events. Introducing the Dark Multiverse, a twisted, parodic reflection of the main multiverse, DC's mythos essentially got a grab bag of stories to tell, where they could remix and reimagine some of their most iconic storylines and characters into darker versions of themselves. So, from a publisher's perspective, Tales from the Dark Multiverse serves as a way to capitalize on readers' nostalgia and familiarity with famously established elements of DC canon. But that's still not quite really enough to build a series like this around. So most writers have interwoven a narrative theme that enhances the approach towards this anthology series as an opportunity to engage in an exploration of tragedy. And the series itself fully admits this exploration frequently. The central storyteller of the series, Tempest Fugonaut, makes it pretty explicit throughout most stories that his work monitoring the Dark Multiverse often boils down to watching tragedy after tragedy. And so seeing an entire series dedicated to presenting and exploring tragedies in the lives of iconic characters and storylines may elicit two types of responses from readers. On one hand, a reader may look at the series as diluting the impact and significance of the original source material, or maybe even devolving into a monotonous drone of pessimism and needless grit. Or a reader may look at the series as an opportunity to look at how the genre of tragedy has manifested over the course of literature, or even on a smaller scope, the course of comics literature. Now, personally, I tend to be a glass half full kind of guy, so I prefer to look at the series as an opportunity to learn about some of the history behind tragic thoughts, reflect on how it's affective in Tales from the Dark Multiverse, and better appreciate the series overall. So, like I mentioned, it's worth talking about how tragedies tend to be used within the pop genre of the superhero comic. More often than not, tragedies tend to be transformative experiences and opportunities for characters to have a moment of growth and development within their story. I have 3 classic examples of superhero tragedies on the screen right now, but don't worry, there are plenty more to pick from. Now, the trend tends to be that in superhero comics, tragedies present an opportunity to define a character's mission and shape their philosophies. And there's a reason for why most tragedies result in this kind of transformative consequence for characters in comics. It's largely because, as Doug touched on, comics' reputation of having decades-long canon and backstory for their characters. I'm pulling this quote from Jason Mattel's book, Complex TV, The Poetics of Contemporary Television Storytelling. And while it's written in the context of discussing how television tends to be written, it does highlight a key feature of comic book storytelling in general. Unlike nearly every other narrative medium except comics, American commercial television operates on what might be termed the infinite model of storytelling. A series is deemed a success only as long as it keeps going. So, as Mattel points out, comics is one of the few storytelling formats that has largely navigated most of their storytelling process around the ability to perpetually tell more stories using the same cast of characters. And so with this framework in mind, it can be really hard to sometimes write a normative tragedy because the publishing model dictates the need for something to always happen next. What happens after Spidey loses Gwen Stacy? What happens once Batman loses a Robin? And so in a very healthy and admirable way, most writers tend to make the next part of the tragedy an opportunity for characters to better understand themselves, their world, and their motivations. Overall, from these tropes and trends, tragedies have historically been for the characters within comics. They're the ones who get the most growth out of the situation. But on the flip side of this, the tragedies we see in the Tales from the Dark Multiverse are different. We find that the anthology series is a separation from this approach towards storytelling. In Tales from the Dark Multiverse, these characters aren't supposed to have the type of character development and emotional growth that they usually would otherwise. And in a way, they're not allowed to. As an anthology series, the storytelling model for Tales doesn't have to worry about the consequences of what happens next once they've told their tragedy. And so this offers the writers a chance at conclusive finality for their plot. Meanwhile, through the lens of the series' own lore, the Dark Multiverse is supposed to be a realm soaked in travesty. As the multiverse's dark counterpart, the worlds we read about in Tales are damned to be uncanny mirror reflections of the mainline stories we know and love. So instead of seeing character growth and development, we tend to see slow descents into madness and misfortune. And so all of this is supposed to color the context behind why we might see certain approaches or trends within these several stories told within the pages of Tales. And because of the anthology series' divergence from the tropes that tragedy tends to play in superhero comics, we often find that Tales from the Dark Multiverse emulates the type of tragedies more commonly found in classical literature instead, which also tend to be far more conclusive and final with their plots. Now, it's hard to generalize the history and characteristics of tragedy, as it's a genre that's been around for millennia at this point. But probably the most famous starting point for understanding tragedy in Western literature for its centuries of discussion can come from Aristotle's Poetics. Not to get too deep into the weight of Aristotle's literary philosophy, it's important to at least recognize that his ideas and observations around the tragedies of his era have largely shaped writing in the Western world ever since they were spread and praised from the Renaissance for centuries afterwards. So, what are a few features of Aristotle's definition of tragedy that come up in Tales from the Dark Multiverse? Well, there are three main features I'm interested in talking about: the concept of peripeteia, the heightening of a twist, and the emotional consequence of catharsis. To start things off, most every story in Tales results from what Aristotle refers to as peripeteia, or the reversal of fortune. To go through some quick examples of the peripeteia of the first volume of Tales from the Dark Multiverse, we have when Batman fails to reclaim the cowl in Nightfall. We also have when Sinestro hesitates to share the power of the White Lantern in Blackest Night. And then there's also when Ted Cord murders Maxwell Lord in the lead up to Infinite Crisis. The entire concept of Tales from the Dark Multiverse is built on Aristotle's notion of peripeteia and how it's valuable as an element to complex tragedies. For each story, this is where their plots begin. And then the pages that follow are meant to explore where this reversal can take our cast of characters. Now, secondly, we can also talk about Aristotle's notion of a twist being a valuable component in tragic stories. Now, Aristotle didn't necessarily use the word twist when he was writing Poetics, so here's a more accurate quote of what I'm pulling from. Tragedy is an imitation not only of a complete action, but of events inspiring fear or pity. Such an effect is best produced when the events come on us by surprise. So I'm taking some liberties with it, but overall, I would call that a twist. And at a glance, this is absolutely core to the storytelling in Tales of the Dark Multiverse, as it's often where the stories reach their climactic end. For example, when Batman's experience under Nightfall causes him to distrust those around him and destructively claim all of Gotham in a power trip, we can understand that this is a huge twist compared to the original Nightfall event, where instead, Bruce realizes he can rely on the Bat family to help protect his city in a moment of character growth. For another twist that tugs at the heartstrings, we can see Death of Superman, where Lois Lane goes mad with vengeance for Superman's death. But then it turns out that Superman still comes back, only to die shortly after realizing just how far the love of his life has really gone. And for the last element of Aristotelian tragedy, I'll be talking about, there's Aristotle's explanation of tragedy as creating catharsis for the audience. Now, there are two main features to discuss with this. For one thing, Aristotle notices that tragedies tend to elicit emotions like pity and fear, but specifically for the purpose of purging these emotions afterwards in a healthy space. And again, this is something that Tales completely confesses to doing within their stories. But there's also a more subtle consequence that Aristotle describes with this quote. And it's that he points out that the audience plays a role in the experience of tragedy. To refer to a quote from earlier, transformative tragedies in comics are tragedies for the characters. Meanwhile, by contrast, since Aristotelian tragedies connect with the reader so much, cathartic tragedies in literature are more so tragedies for the audience. And again, Tales from the Dark Multiverse touches on this concept, particularly in the remix of Dark Knight's Metal, where we find a grown Duke Thomas who escapes his darker and grittier world and confronts Tempest Fuginaut. And Duke goes so far as to call the experiences of reading tragedies into question when he criticizes Tempest for being nothing more than a voyeur for the travesties of the Dark Multiverse. So all of this is to demonstrate that Tales is a fascinating collection of stories that do an admirable job of exploring tragedies as they've existed in classical literature. But to only look at Tales through this lens is still a limiting experience, as it completely overlooks how its existence within the comic book medium offers so much more for readers. Overall, Tales from the Dark Multiverse can be understood as presenting a storytelling experience that can combine some of the best features of tragedies in most literature and the features that make comics so special and fascinating. On one hand, the series offers the introspection and reflection brought from normative stories about tragedy. And on the other hand, it also offers the experience for comparative analysis across stories, so as to analyze the motivations and themes that the original source material had and recontextualize details and concepts we often take for granted about our characters. And again, as Doug so excellently explained, this is one of the best things about comics in general, when you get to read them and see that they're always referring and pulling back from their larger history. But overall, that's my time for this presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the other lovely panelists we have for today.
Thanks, Mel. Just want to mention a couple of things. We're nearly at $1,000 in donations, so thank you for everyone who's donated so far.
That is
To anyone,
fantastic.
it is. And to anyone who wants to help us reach that first milestone, the links should be in the description, and our moderator should be putting them in the chat room right now. You can donate on Tiltify, and to anyone who donates over the course of this panel, there is going to be a prize that's randomly selected at the end. You'll be receiving books 1 and 2 of Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol on Comixology. Fantastic stuff. And this is all for a great cause. So if you want to get involved, please donate any amount if you can. I think we're getting along a little bit in time, so let's move on to our next speaker.
Thank you, Doug and Mel. Fantastic work. And to you as well, Doug, of course. And we can just dive into it on the topic of Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Cole. I'm from the highly acclaimed YouTube channel Critical Rants, and my presentation is titled, give me one moment to pull it up, The Many Meaningless Merits of Mr. Nobody, or How Grant Morrison Created One of Comics' Grooviest Villains. Now, if you're a fan of Doom Patrol comics, or if you're a fan of the Doom Patrol TV show, you're likely familiar with the name Mr. Nobody, but in case you're not, just strap yourself in because things are about to get weird. Now, the Doom Patrol, from their inception back in the early 1960s, proudly wore the patch of the world's strangest superheroes, and their villains often matched their, shall we say, uniqueness. Eric Morden was one such villain, albeit much closer to the realm of the ordinary than many others. His humble origin saw him attempting to join the villainous group known as the Brotherhood of Evil by unleashing a wave of destruction after a giant red robot named Rog. With a giant red robot named Rog. After his plan, which also involved, of course, stealing the Statue of Liberty, was thwarted by the Doom Patrol, his membership in the Brotherhood of Evil was denied, and we wouldn't see or hear of Morden again until 1989, when legendary writer Grant Morrison would reinvent this one-off adversary in the pages of their now beloved run of Doom Patrol. Somewhat ironically, Eric Morden as a character was a nobody, someone practically lost to the sands of time, when Morrison decided to turn him into whatever Mr. Nobody ended up being. Morrison would explain in the pages of issue 26 that Morden, after fleeing the Brotherhood of Evil, would undergo a bizarre procedure conducted by a Nazi scientist that ultimately drove him insane before he emerged reborn as the somewhat two-dimensional, absurdist being known as Mr. Nobody. In the newly born man's own words, Mr. Morden was gone, wiped out like a chalk drawing on a slate. I had become the spirit of the 21st century, the abstract man, the virtual man, the notional man, Mr. Nobody. Mr. Nobody would appear primarily in 2 story arcs across the run comprising of 4 issues each, The Painting That Ate Paris, and Mr. Nobody's infamous run for the office of President of the United States. Yet no man is an island, and Mr. Nobody's first act in Morrison's Doom Patrol sees him assembling a brotherhood of his own, one he would eventually title the Brotherhood of Dada. The Brotherhood of Dada consists of Mr. Nobody himself, as well as several other kooky characters. There's Frenzy, a man able to convert himself into a living cyclone, the Fog, who is capable of absorbing other human beings and retaining their distinct personalities within him, Sleepwalk, who possesses incredible super strength, but only while sleepwalking, and finally the Quiz, a germaphobe who has every superpower that you haven't thought of. It's a bit of a weird bunch. Now, despite the name of the new and improved Brotherhood representing meaninglessness itself, the name of the Brotherhood of Dada within the narrative is itself not meaningless. And hopefully that will make sense in a moment, as Dada is a style of art that largely originated in response to the First World War. Often described as anti-art, Dadaism focused precisely on a lack of logic, a lack of reason, and a lack of conformity, and the genre frequently invokes sentiments against war, capitalism, and materialism. Now, say what you will about Mr. Nobody, but a capitalist and a conformist he is not. This is evidenced in issue 27, when Mr. Nobody tells a policeman that he doesn't speak fascist before promptly turning said policeman into a toilet. Now, Dadaism spanned many genres of art, but it's poetry that Morrison most utilizes within Doom Patrol, with many text boxes and pages stuffed to the brim with stream of consciousness poems and wild collage-like imagery. In fact, Morrison even cited the cut-up technique as a method they used to help them write parts of Doom Patrol. Dadaist in origin, the cut-up technique involves cutting words out from a newspaper or magazine and rearranging them in a new order to form a poem. And this way of writing can even be witnessed directly in Doom Patrol in creatures known as the Scissormen, who speak entirely in cut-up sentences. You can certainly see the influence of this unfiltered approach to storytelling in Mr. Nobody himself. There is his tendency to spout his silly and occasionally musical thoughts to whomever surrounds him, but let's take a closer look at the dastardly designs of this two-dimensional Dadaist, because Mr. Nobody's goals aren't those of a traditional supervillain. He doesn't desperately want to kill or even defeat the heroes of the Doom Patrol. He isn't out for revenge. He doesn't want to use his abilities to attain power or personal wealth, and he doesn't want to conquer the universe, at least not in the traditional sense. When Mr. Nobody does take over the world, he does so by spiking a rubber chicken on the ground and proudly declaring, "There, we have now taken over the world. What are you going to do about that?" By his very nature, Mr. Nobody defies conventions and descriptions, but let's do our best to pin down his motivations here. If there's a single thesis to Mr. Nobody's actions, as he himself puts it, it's to celebrate the absurdity of life. But what specifically does this entail? Well, this entails acquiring a psychoactive painting capable of swallowing the world, merging said painting with reality, running for president of the United States of America on the platform that every day will be Christmas, using Batman as an ashtray, whatever that means, and of course, adding an extra 1.5 inches to rulers. Just to name a few. Perhaps by attempting to pin down Mr. Nobody's identity is to miss the point and joy of his character, because Mr. Nobody simply is. There's not really a reason for Mr. Nobody to do anything, but that's exactly the reason why he does what he does. Where other villains ask why, Mr. Nobody asks why not, and would you like to ride in my tour bus that's powered by a magical psychedelic bicycle? It would be easy to glance at Mr. Nobody and write him off as a collection of random nonsense words and vaguely absurd ideologies. And on some level, that is one way of viewing Mr. Nobody, as even a surface level examination of this character still reads as him being an absolute joy to experience. Say what you will about Mr. Nobody, but the guy is certainly not lacking charisma. And getting swept up in the sheer ridiculousness of his character is arguably the entire point of his character. But in my opinion, Mr. Nobody is much more than a series of gags and punchlines. And to understand why, we'll have to discuss his untimely demise. When Mr. Nobody is eventually defeated, it isn't even by
Okay.
Sorry, booted out there. What was where was the last thing that I was on before I got kicked?
I think you were
His
just
demise.
talking. Yes.
Excellent. All right, I might be retreading a little ground here. So you know, it's the joys of live television, so to speak. But I might be retreading a little ground. I'll just go right back through it.
Sounds good.
Let me reshare my screen. Just, you know, always nice to be on your toes. All righty. And we're just going to skip past this. And there we go. So the Pentagon sends a mystical, many-faced agent known as John Dandy to assassinate Mr. Nobody. and the Brotherhood of Dada, which tragically is a task that Dandy succeeds at. In his final moments before he fades away into nothingness, Mr. Nobody laments that people didn't want strangeness and unpredictability in their lives, and that sooner or later, they'll miss what he was offering. While this wouldn't be the last we'd ever see of Mr. Nobody within Doom Patrol comics in general, it would be the last we'd see of the delightful fellow in Morrison's run. What's almost baffling is, as I stated previously, that the Doom Patrol themselves don't stop Nobody. It's only the intervention of the government that ultimately brings him down. In most superhero stories, I'd say that the heroes not being responsible for stopping their antagonist would be considered a negative. But I don't think that's the case for Doom Patrol and Mr. Nobody, because neither is interested in sticking to conventions. Towards the end of the Painting That Ate Paris arc, Mr. Nobody succeeds at bringing the entire city of Paris into a magical, many-layered painting. But in doing so, he inadvertently unleashes the fifth horseman of the apocalypse that lay dormant within the painting, and which now, naturally, threatens to destroy all of time and space. Yes, Doom Patrol comics are weird. It is through this sudden disaster unfolding that Jane, a member of the Doom Patrol who began the run devoid of purpose in a mental asylum, recognizes her own capability and steps up to defeat the Horsemen to save the day. Mr. Nobody even assists Jane in toppling this behemoth by encouraging the Doom Patrol to join hands with the Brotherhood of Dada and send her their superpowered energy to help guide her, in an act that Mr. Nobody describes as a groovy lovin' that is so embarrassing that it has to work. Mr. Nobody, as always, is correct, and the two rivalrous teams effectively end up utilizing the power of friendship to defeat a being that would have erased all of existence. Not only is that immensely ridiculous and entertaining, but it also challenged one of the heroes to grow as a character, which shows how genuinely effective Mr. Nobody is as a villain in Doom Patrol's narrative. Robot Man is another character who is amply effective by the antagonist's asinine antics. As someone who is merely a brain in a robot body, Cliff Steele's main struggle throughout the story involves coming to terms with the absurdity of his own existence. Mr. Nobody calls this into question for obvious reasons, particularly when his run for the presidency gains so much popularity, which only deepens Robot Man's inability to accept the increasingly strange misadventures he embarks upon as part of the Doom Patrol. I think that Mr. Nobody is such a bizarre and outlandish villain that he shouldn't really work on paper. But I think that's exactly the takeaway here. If something doesn't work on paper, then cut up that paper and rearrange the words. Carpet your comic books in blocks of awkward, dreamlike poetry. Hold hands with your enemies and run for president if that's how you want to change the world. Ultimately, there are no rules that you must follow when it comes to creating stories, and there's not one set path that you have to walk on to get where you want to go. Grant Morrison's process for writing their Doom Patrol run, much like the run itself, was not exactly traditional. In addition to the aforementioned cut-up technique, Morrison would also fill notebook pages with whatever thoughts and words popped into their head, and return to these notebooks months later to pick out recurring themes and images that they would then jam into the pages of Doom Patrol. They even recalled using a computer spell check function by writing entirely in nonsense words, but with roughly proper syntax and sentence structure. Spellcheck would then suggest an alternative for each word, and after substituting in all of Spellcheck's suggested corrections, the result was what the writer described as a run of really bizarre, disconnected poetic images. Morrison has even admitted to writing several issues of Doom Patrol while under the influence of magic mushrooms, which, given the psychedelic nature of Mr. Nobody and the strangeness of the story itself, should really come at no surprise at this point. Now, given that this is the academia panel, I think it's only fair that I end my presentation with a homework assignment, and it's pretty simple and it is multiple choice. Option A is to make a Dadaist cut-up poem. Option B is to fill a page stream of consciousness style with your completely unfiltered thoughts and images. And option C is to use spellcheck in the way Morrison did to conjure up a bizarrely beautiful string of nonsense. And then if you're feeling generous, you can share your unique poem in the comments below or with me on Twitter, where my handle is at @critical_rants. I genuinely love to see all of your strange creations, and you never know how useful those strange creations could end up being. That's it for me, but it's been a true honor to take part in this panel, and please donate if you can. And as for the rest, I just hope you enjoy what's left of At Home Comic Con. Stay groovy, everyone.
Fantastic presentation, Cole. It's funny, when we were rehearsing all of this, it kind of came about that Morrison was the through line through all of our presentations, these weird cosmic stories that defy convention. And I'm not gonna lie, I think it's nearly impossible to top their Doom Patrol run, just for the sheer creativity behind everything. And
Not disagree.
speaking of, if you would like to get into the series, if you'd like the first two books, we have those up for giveaway right now. If you donate anytime during this panel, you'll be entered to win. We should be announcing a winner soon. But we're this close to reaching 800. We'd really appreciate any donations that you have. Any amount helps, and it's for a fantastic cause. But with that said, I think it's time for us to move on to our next presenter, which I believe is Danny.
Okay, hello there. I've just seen on Twitter that one of my students from 10 years ago is watching this. So a big shout out to Sam Palmer. Nice to hear from you. So let me just get this shared. Presentation. Okay, you guys can see that okay? All right. So, hello there. My name is Danny Graydon. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire in Great Britain. I teach on the world-renowned digital animation undergraduate degree course there, where I'm the head of contextual studies. So looking at history and theory surrounding various animation precepts. And I am a lifelong fan of superheroes, and I've been quite fortunate in my career to be able to take that with me into the professional realm. Before I was an academic, from 2010, I was a journalist, and I wrote about comics and superheroes professionally. But I really can't remember a time when superheroes weren't really a part of my life. And now I've joined the academic realm over the last decade or so. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to be talking about this stuff. Now, obviously, talking about superheroes and academia is quite a very large subject. So what we're really going to be doing over the next 15 minutes or so is just taking a quick ramble through and just giving you guys an idea of the various avenues that are available. I know that there is a general assumption that superheroes are, childish fictions, and they're not really capable of such scholarly scrutiny, but I would challenge that assumption only too greatly. First of all, then, let's go back 50 years to 1972. In an issue of Dialectics, the Italian semiotician Umberto Eco published an essay called The Myth of Superman. This was in fact originally published in Italian in 1962, but was really a very, very serious look at really the comics of Superman from the 1950s. But only a mere 24 years into Superman's creation and longevity, it was quite clear that he was capable of taking a very, very serious scholarly reading. In this essay, which you can find in a book by Eco called The Role of the Reader, you will see how Eco starts to make alignments between Superman as a character and also the dynamics of mythology. And there he makes some very, very interesting observations about Superman insofar as that as a character, he's so powerful that he is able to affect global geopolitics, and no army can go up against him. And yet he basically contains all of his adventures in an American city and is generally deemed to not ever be a problem to his host nation of America. He also talked about the idea that while Superman has aspects of mythology and so therefore is inconsumable, he is, of course, an ongoing commercial publication. So there are notions where Superman doesn't really develop as a character, and it's important that he remains that way. And of course, That contributes to what we know and love about a superhero like Superman, is that he doesn't change and that he remains timeless, as he has done so over the 80 plus years that he has been around. Ian Gordon, an academic, saw the myth of Superman as being very much a foundational text in terms of any serious considerations of not only Superman, but the superhero genre more widely. Of course, around this time that Echo first wrote that piece in 1962, a few years afterwards, you get this. Comics editor Jules Pfeiffer did what was really the first sustained essay on these adventure characters that came to life in the late 1930s, and was really something of a fond reminiscence of the work that he was doing in the 1940s and 50s, actually watching these characters gain popularity. So at the time that this was written in 1965, as the Fantagraphics publisher Gary Groth notes, that no one was really writing about superheroes, not seriously, and certainly not with any scholarly application like theories of Jacques Derrida or Lacanian psychoanalysis. But certainly it showed that as these characters were getting a greater degree of popularity and how they were embedding themselves in popular culture, there was certainly scope to be looking at them seriously and assessing the ways that they impact popular culture and have been embraced by generations of fandom. Certainly by the late 1980s, when Superman, of course, hit 50 years old, there was a book that celebrated this terrific milestone in the superhero genre, which was edited by Dennis Dooley and Gary Engel, in which there were a series of essays that, while not strictly fully academic, really sought to get to grips with Superman's legacy, his impact on popular culture. And this is a book that I very, very much loved when I was a teenager myself, mainly because the figure of Superman and superheroes more widely were being treated seriously. And not only that, as the clear modern mythology that they so very obviously are. Of course, by the time we get to the mid-1980s, and specifically the publication of The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, and of course Watchmen the following year by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, superhero comics were finally in a position, after some 40 years, of being able to elevate themselves beyond the so-called perceived childish constraints of superhero comics, and we're becoming something approximating literature. Certainly, if you look at something like Watchmen, you see a very, very incisive deconstruction of superheroic archetypes like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, etc. But also, Alan Moore was doing something very, very strong with the actual language of comics itself, creating a crystalline narrative that was profoundly impressive and certainly brought it on a par with literature. And this was noted by many, many critics at the time. Of course, if we refer to Batman, I was saying to the panelists last night that I see that 1986 to 1996 is really Batman's zenith, where you were getting an increasing degree of popularity, a mainstream attention of comics like Dark Knight, Batman Year One, The Killing Joke, etc., etc. And this was compounded by the global success of the Batman film in 1989, directed by Tim Burton. In that entire decade, Batman was, firing on all cylinders, and everything that was coming out at that time, whether it be the Batman animated series or the Elseworlds graphic novels like Gotham by Gaslight, these were, the highest of times for Batman. Indeed, the feminist critic Gloria Steinem, just before Superman's 50th anniversary, said that Superman was our version of a Greek myth. He was an inspiration of ordinary people. So no longer were these characters solely constrained to the so-called childish realm of superhero comics. They were bigger than that. And more critical theorists were acknowledging that superheroes very much accorded to mythological structures, but actually had a significant impact on global popular culture. And for those of you who remember, when the Batman film was released in 1989, that symbol of the bat symbol was one of the most famous symbols on the planet. But if we go to the early 1990s, this was certainly when academic studies of superheroes were gaining significant traction. 30 years ago in 1991, Roberta E. Pearson and William Ulrichio published via the British Film Institute, The Many Lives of the Batman. I was 17 at the time that this book came out, and it was thoroughly inspirational for me because I realized that my beloved Batman was being treated with academic seriousness, was not treated as a joke, which was very much part and parcel of a legacy of the 60s TV series that was seen as very, very camp, even though it's highly regarded now. But the essays that were included in The Many Lives of the Batman certainly took a look at the legacy of the 60s TV series and also how Batman was, a global concern. The following year, you have Superheroes, A Modern Mythology by the wonderful Richard Reynolds, which is also I would call a centrifugal text within scholarly discourses around superheroes. What Richard was doing in this particular book was showing how via texts like Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, that superheroes, whether it be X-Men or, and all other kinds of characters, the Punisher, conform to this much wider form of a mythology. And certainly Paul Levitz, the one-time president and publisher of DC Comics, habitually referred to superheroes as being a modern form of folklore. So in these two books in the 1990s, you certainly start to see that there is a burgeoning arena of people wanting to write about superheroes in a much more serious fashion. This, of course, led to the work of Will Brooker, who is a professor of film studies at Kingston University in London. Roberta Pearson and William Ulrichio were Will Brooker's PhD supervisors, and Will Brooker was the very first person to actually gain his doctorate in Batman, gaining him the nickname of Dr. Batman. And this was very, very important because it showed that a character like Batman could sustain a very, very lengthy scholarly analysis, of PhD being 100,000 words. And of course, that PhD that Professor Brooker produced went into the book Batman Unmasked. But since that time, in 2012, he also looked at Hunting the Dark Knight in 21st Century Batman. Brooker's view and his analyses of Batman, I think, are not only fundamental, but centrifugal to how we understand superheroes today. Among the most important things that he said was that Batman was a mosaic character, which is to say that every version of Batman, whether it be the 60s TV show, the 1989 Burton film, or the Nolan Batman or the Grant Morrison series that was 1,500 pages long, they are all as valid as each other. And they make a similarly suitable contribution to the wider mythos of Batman. He also provided some very, very intriguing and interesting queer and feminist readings of Batman, which again just went to show that these characters can withhold and sustain a whole variety of critical lenses to be viewed by. Indeed, about 5 or so years ago, Brooker teamed up with his old PhD supervisors to provide a sequel of sorts to that 1991 book called The Many More Lives of the Batman, which featured interviews with famous Batman writers and artists, as well as revisiting the fact that in the last sort of 25 years or 30 years since that book was published, that Batman has become very much a global concern, but not only that, transmedial too, existing within comics, films, animations, audio adventures, etc., etc. Where do I fit into this? In 2015, I published my first academic text with my colleague at the University of Hertfordshire, Barbara Brownie. This was the superhero costume, Identity in Disguise in Fact and Fiction, which was the first real scholarly study of this core part of the superhero mythos. Not only did we look at the way that the superhero costume is coded and provides informational pieces of a superhero's identity and values. We also looked at the way that this could be codified into such aspects of the mask. But beyond looking at the comics, where we looked at things like Watchmen and X-Men, we also looked at the superhero costume in terms of how it is adapted for the screen. The superhero costume, of course, is an impossible garment. And if you look at the whole range of superhero movies that we've seen in the last 40 odd years, that certainly, the molded rubber muscles that you see is really one of the ways that you are able to achieve that sort of otherness that comes with the superhero costume. But we also assessed it in terms of cosplay and the real life superhero movement of, say, 10 or so years ago. But it was around this time in 2015 that I wanted to make a greater contribution to the way that superhero studies was evolving. Certainly, superhero studies exploded post-2000 when, of course, you had the release of Bryan Singer's X-Men. And of course, in the last 15 odd years, we've had the sheer growth of the MCU. The first time that you've had a whole tapestry of superheroes interconnected in 25 plus films. And I'm certainly of an age group that in the 1990s, I could never really have perceived of a Spider-Man movie being possible. And all of these years later, there's now been 8 or 9 of them, which just goes to show you how technology has caught up with the sheer grand scope of superheroes and allowed these cosmic tales of good and evil to be successfully put on the screen. So it was around this time that I founded an ongoing academic project called the Superhero Project, nifty name, that I set up with Dr. Barbara Brownie, my colleague, once again, at the University of Hertfordshire. Originally, this was an academic conference that was set up with interdisciplinary.net, and the first 2 editions in 2016 and 17 were held at Mansfield College in Oxford. Since 2019, the Superhero Project has become an ongoing collaboration with the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, and I co-direct this enterprise with Dr. Torsten Kahners of the Anglophone Studies department at that university. So in the last 6 years, we have had 5 editions of the Superhero Project, most recently, just a few weeks ago, in Mulheim an der Ruhr in Germany. We are very proud of the fact that we have gathered scholars from all over the world who join us, whether it's actually live or online via Zoom, and they provide a whole myriad of perspectives and explorations of the superhero genre in all of its forms. And certainly what I wanted to do with the Superhero Project was make a dedicated space for the scholarly exploration of the superhero in all of its forms, no matter what. And while, of course, we intend to have suitable academic rigor, it is bound by a passion, a fan's passion for the genre. That's where I come from, and I've been reading superhero comics for 40 odd years now. But over the 5 editions, we have had nearly 150 papers produced, which have allowed us to ensure quite a considerable diversity and really showcasing the ways that the superhero genre can withstand, once again, this kind of scholarly activity. Next year, we will be producing our first book of the Superhero Project, which is called Supercultures, which will be intended to be an annual book, which will spin out of the conference, which will showcase the papers from the conference in terms of a theme. This year at the 5th Global Meeting, it was the progressive age of the superhero that has arisen in the last 20 odd years of superhero history. This is me just a couple of weeks ago at the 5th edition, where I was talking about parenthood in relation to Superman. And I was looking at a paradigm that was put forward by Peter Coogan of the definition of the superhero, which puts forward mission, powers, and identity, arguing, of course, that if a superhero like Superman becomes a parent, they are also concerned with the provision of legacy. And of course, we now see that we have Superman, son of Kal-El, taking over the mantle. These are the delegates, the live delegates of the Superhero Project 5 that we had in Mulheim an der Ruhr. So we have a diversity of countries representing them, but we wanted to provide this dedicated space, and I think that we have been successful thus far, and we're certainly looking to grow that. But what I wanted to say finally is that there are many people who are watching this who may think that there is very few opportunities to write about superheroes in a very serious and scholarly academic fashion. To those of you who are making that assumption, I would say that there are more opportunities than ever to be writing about your beloved characters. Certainly, where once Dr. Will Brooker stood alone in the field as someone who possessed a doctorate in superheroes, now there are hundreds of people who are actively engaged around the world, maybe even thousands. And certainly, that the superhero project provides a space for those people to come and talk about these kinds of things. And I know that there are symposia, popping up all around the globe at the moment where superheroes are being discussed with vigor, and there are books coming out dozens of times every year. Certainly you will have cultural history works like Super Gods by Grant Morrison, or Glenn Weldon, who recently wrote a book about Batman and the rise of nerd culture. But then you will get people like Neil Curtis from New Zealand, who will write a book dedicated to superheroes and sovereignty. Other books that talk about superheroes and hypermasculinity and the infusion of toxic masculinity. So anything that you think of, I can assure you that these are lenses by which you can see the superhero and understand why they have become an important part not only of our global popular culture, but of course, these are characters who are heading towards a full century of continuous publication in multiple media. There's a reason for that, because they present an elemental power in their mainstay. So thank you very much for having me along to this event today, and I hope it's been informative for you. And thank you to my fellow panelists for being so very, very interesting. And I look forward to the rest of this event. Thank you.
That was a spectacular presentation, Danny. Thank you for doing that. I've become aware of the Superhero Project over the past year, and I've just been endlessly fascinated with it. Because I mean, it's like we keep saying, comic books are a real art in their own, and it's always worth exploring something that creates so much passion and enthusiasm in a community. And speaking of enthusiasm, thank you to everyone who's just been donating over the last stretch of the panel. We're $5 away from crossing 1,000 in donations. Thank you so much. Special shout out goes to Diego Rivera. Could I get a hashtag spawn timber in the chat, please? I'm just going to wait for that to circle through. But we're coming up on our time pretty fast. I don't want to hold anyone up anymore. We have one more presenter, the endlessly talented Michaela Laird. Michaela, take it away.
Thank you. I don't know if I have the honor or the short straw of following everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Michaela J. Laird. I am a comics doctor in training. I am a former student of the esteemed Danny Graydon, who you all just heard from, and the Robin of the Superhero Project, the only delegate that was not in that photo because I took the photo. Now, what I wanted to present today is just a short snippet of my research, and it does sort of tie together everything we've been talking about why studying comics and studying superheroes is so important. So, like I said, I am a doctoral student, and I look at how time is portrayed within comics. And it may sound a little bit of an obvious thing to look at, but by breaking down these techniques that artists and writers use, we can understand and better communicate the passage of time within comics. What you're seeing on screen now is like 2 extracts of a chapter that is going to be rewritten a million times, I'm sure. But one of the first things we might logically consider is panel layout and construction. And this is indeed important, as how panels are presented and layout determine how your eye navigates the page and the order in which you will see each panel. And of course, this goes slow to move. Thank you. And the same is also true for carriers, which is the collective name for things like narrative caption and speech balloons. So how they're positioned relative to both the panel and each other will guide your eye of how you read it through. Even smaller details, such as a character's relative positioning or facial expressions changing between panels, can give the reader a sense of timing involved. So we understand, due to our own experiences, and I just realized the chat popped up. So we understand, due to our own experience of the world, due to pacing, rhythm, and context of a story, that we can transplant our own experiences in the place of these characters, such as how long it takes to change facial expressions between panels, or how long it might take you to say a particular line. You can understand these things because you live it every single day. But this is especially pertinent when it comes to superhero comics, where there are things going on that we can't do. At least I haven't met anyone who can actually fly. So this brings us to what I actually want to talk about, and this is the chapter I'm working on at the moment. This is indexical lines and polymorphic imagery. And while the name might not sound very familiar, their functions are fundamental to comics, especially in superhero comics. So indexical lines are the collective term we give to things such as motion lines and lines of sight. So indexical lines, as you'll see in this diagram, fall into two categories: path lines and diegetic lines. Both act as arrows in order to direct the reader's attention to a specific focal point. However, each do it in different ways and for a different purpose. Like I said, there's a diagram on screen that is based on one created by Neil Cohen, but I've thrown in superhero stuff because I thought it made it look more cool. That sort of shows you how both path lines and diegetic lines break down into different areas. So this would be for path lines, motion, radical, and scope. And for diegetic, they have their own version of scopic and zooming. And I'm going to go through those quickly now. What I'm about to cover is a very condensed version of the chapter I'm working on. And to emphasize this, I have on screen all the raw data from just the first issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So if any of this gets really confusing or really boring, you can shut me up by donating to charity. That's my poor attempt at humor. But because I'm a sucker for Superman, I'll be using some Superman issues as examples here. So expect a lot of the Man of Steel. So beginning with motion lines, we have lines that denote both where the action begins and where it currently ends. In this example from John Byrne's Man of Steel, you see the motion lines around Clark and his dog in the first two panels. We can see in this first panel that the dog jumps against Clark. Clark jolts back slightly. His head moves thanks to the weight of the dog's paws, and his right leg moves to shift his weight to compensate. This leads to the second panel, where now that the weight has shifted, Clark realizes there is nothing below his left leg, even shaking his foot slightly, as indicated by the motion lines, to double check. In the final panel, we see Clark flying through the air. The motion lines beginning exactly where Clark was in the previous panel, as shown by this small little sketch of the dog barking, and ends at Clark's current position. So different countries actually have different ways of presenting motion lines historically. And what we see here in American comics is almost a midway point. So European comics, as you'll see on the left, which is an old Tintin from Belgium, they use much shorter and limited amount of lines, as where with Japanese manga, you will see an excessive amount of lines to the point that it almost leads into reduction. So motion lines sort of bleed into the moving figure. And as I say, American comics sort of fit in between the two. And in fact, I would say that the reduction aspect of Japanese comics almost make an action more intense, as where with the Belgium example on the left, it's not as intense, maybe even slower in motion, or giving off the impression of something is slower. Of course, over time, we've had artists that have sort of blended these techniques a lot more obviously. An example being Jorge Jimenez, who for Scott Snyder's Justice League run did this fantastic homage to the Gohan Kamehameha in the Cell games, because I had to fit Dragon Ball somewhere. But if we go back to this image of Clark flying in terms of time, we know that the amount of time in this panel encompasses however long it took Clark to reach this point from the previous panel to where he is now. Based on the shaping of the line, we know that this is a very fast movement. You'll also note that the motion lines have a white coloration between them. And this is actually called a ribbon, and it's a technique wholly unique to American comics for a very long time. And it allows a clearer understanding of motion lines, especially once the pages are colored. So this idea of the ribbon is also frequently used with scopic lines, particularly with superhero books. Traditionally, pathline scopic lines show a character's line of sight. However, when you include the ribbon technique, you are now able to depict superhuman abilities such as X-ray vision or heat vision. In this example from Man and Superman, the light blue signifies the use of X-ray vision being used by Clark Kent. You understand directly where Clark is looking, and based on the color and context, you have a rough understanding of what he is looking at and why. However, this doesn't seem to denote anything to do with time. In contrast, if we make that ribbon for the scopic line red, you'll know that Superman is using his heat vision. This is where colored context comes in. For timing, it is very difficult to pinpoint how long this action would take without context. So finally, for path lines, we have radical lines. And these are a little different from the other two and are primarily used to give the effect of things like heat or smell coming from an object. In the example above, you can see this being used twice. First is the lines representing the light coming from the sun. Again, this does not give us a lot to work with in terms of time, except that it is either early in the day or perhaps even midday due to how high and bright the sun is. Secondary, we see Bruce and Clark drinking some form of hot beverage, and for simplicity's sake, let's just say it's coffee. So the lines coming from both mugs indicate that this is a particularly hot beverage. If it weren't for the fact that we see Clark pouring the coffee, then we'd still know that it was recently poured, just based on the radical lines. So moving to the other side of indexical lines, we have two very simple techniques that make up diegetic lines. And this is another form of scopic, and finally zooming. We're almost at the end, guys. The lecture is nearly over. So the diegetic version of scopic lines does not signify where a character is looking, but instead that something has caught the character's attention. In the example here, Superman comments to John to get his attention and causes him to turn around, and it's a very simple technique, but one that adds immediacy to a character's response. Without it, John is facing Superman. With it, John has rapidly turned around to face Superman. And finally, for lines, we have zooming. This is a technique that treats the frame like a camera and zooms in on a segment of the frame. In this case, we see lines coming in from the side to draw focus to Swamp Thing as he stares up to Superman. Again, this is a technique I'd say was being more used now because we are more prone to borrowing from things like manga. Again, this is a Jorge Jimenez page, so no surprise. So finally, we have the polymorphic image. And you'll likely see this in terms of characters that can move very quickly, like Superman or the Flash. But polymorphic literally means multiple morphing. An image implementing polymorphic imagery shows multiple stages of movement within a single image. In terms of time, it allows an artist and a writer to show time moving at two different speeds for characters involved. So in this example here, you see Lois Lane alongside Clark. as he changes into Superman. While there are multiple steps for Clark's transformation, Lois remains still. This implies that Clark is moving at a fast speed at the frame, faster speed than the frame can capture, but moves too quickly for Lois to fully react to. So polymorphic imagery is becoming increasingly prominent, especially in the last few months of superhero comics, thanks to Tom Taylor and Bruno Redondo's work on Nightwing. It's shown a great experimentation with polymorphic structure, an experimentation that has been greatly received by fans, especially with how well it suits this particular character. So for the cover of Nightwing number 83, the eye follows Nightwing in the same Z-path formation the Western comics follow. The eye begins with Nightwing swinging on from the rafters before jumping over the bars. Our eyes then follow Dick as he removes his Nightwing costume, slowly replacing it with a jacket, shirt, and jeans. As Dick reaches the last rung, he puts his bag containing his costume down, removes his mask, and just before he steps onto the stage at the bottom center of the page, and at the end of Dick's journey, he takes to the podium and announces, "My name is Dick Grayson, and I have an idea." I'm very aware that I'm using the textless version of this, but it is there in the original. So the cover acts as one large panel. We're framed within this moment with Dick's movements dictating the timing. We know from the speech balloon that the final stage of the cover takes the same amount of time it would to say, "My name is Dick Grayson and I have an idea." For each of the other steps, aside from swinging onto the rafters, we can use our own knowledge of hastily getting changed to get a sense of how fast Dick is moving. I'm only saying we can't use common knowledge for rafters because I'm assuming not everyone swings onto rafters every day. But in the second to last action, however, we see diegetic indexical lines in the form of scopic lines around Dick's eyes. And this draws specific attention to not only Dick's face, but shows that his own attention is on his face when he realizes he's still wearing this domino mask. This likely interrupts his pacing while moving to stop, realize, take it off, and then move, changing the pacing. But on September 16th, 2021, Tom Taylor and Bruno Redondo revealed through a Polygon article that Nightwing number 87 would be one continuous image. Just from the cover shown, we can see the same techniques from Nightwing issue 83's cover. Nightwing moving from the distance as he comes closer and closer into frame. While the act of swinging in the same manner of Nightwing is highly unlikely for us to do on a daily basis, we still have an understanding of how long it might take for an acrobat to cover this distance just based on real-world physics and moving around. But the initial press release for Nightwing 87 featured the first few pages of the book, although without color or lettering. We see Taylor and Redondo embracing the idea of capturing a moment in time, and in this case, capturing these specific moments as Dick travels through the city. In conclusion, while the idea of studying time might seem a little pointless, by examining these small little building blocks of comics, we can identify how the comic book medium can move forward. With work from creators like Taylor and Redondo, I'm hopeful that comics still have a very long way to go until there is nothing more to evolve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Right in the nick of time. I'm just going to keep this brief because I think we're right up against it. Thank you to everyone who's donated. We have just crossed our milestone of $1,000 in donations, and we have also chosen our winner. Congratulations to Brian McDermott. You have officially won your Comixology voucher for books 1 and 2 of Doom Patrol. So we'll be reaching out to you soon to facilitate that. In the meantime, we're going to be getting ready for the Heroes Against Humanity panel in about 15 minutes. Hope you all had fun here, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.